Now we've got another fabulous panel for you this afternoon, and the moderator will be Jeanne Cummings, the Deputy Bureau Chief for the Wall Street Journal in Washington, D.C. She was previously the journal's political editor. Before joining the Journal, Jeanne served as the Deputy Managing Editor at Bloomberg, where she covered the White House, Congress, and the 2012 and 2014 elections. She also developed enterprise and analysis pieces that gave readers new insights, more context, and a better understanding of today's fast-paced news events. And our panelists today are Dr. Francis Collins, the Director of the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Michael Dolsten, President, Worldwide Research and Development of Pfizer, Dr. William Hait, the Global Head, Janssen Research and Development, the Global Research and Development arm of Janssen Pharmaceutical Companies of Johnson & Johnson, Dr. Ann Cary, Dean of the School of Nursing and Health Studies at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, Gary Reedy, CEO of the American Cancer Society, Dr. Iris Loew-Friedrich, Chief Medical Officer for UCB, and Dr. David Neal, Senior Vice President for Global Research at Elsevier. Over to you, Jeanne.
Good afternoon, everyone. That's a tough act to follow. That was a really interesting panel that you all just had, but you now have an array of brilliant minds again in front of you, myself not included. As she noted, I cover politics. So, we don't cure anything, we don't heal anything, we pray for fights. So, and injuries, blood works, it all
prayers
works.
are answered very regularly,
Yes,
too.
indeed. We call that job security. So I wanted to start us off with a question here for Dr. Collins. When we talk about ending disease, there are all kinds of ramifications, but there's an awfully long road to that particular goal. And for a long time, we've been hearing a lot about research into genes and other different types of research work that initially held such promise. Can you bring us up to date on whether expectations were too high? How well is it going? What is the status?
So yeah, absolutely. Delighted to be part of the panel. I'll try to make what could be a 2-hour presentation very quick here in terms of what's the promise, where are we? I do think we have some unprecedented opportunities in medical research, and accelerating that pace is highly justifiable. And I'm glad to be on the panel here with other people who are part of that important ecosystem that has made America such a successful story in this regard. Let's talk about first prevention, because if you want to reduce illness, it's better not to have it happen in the first place. In that regard, I'm happy to highlight, for instance, the Lasker Award going to Doug Loewy and John Schiller for HPV vaccine. There's a prevention strategy just this week being recognized in that way. That kind of approach we should be pushing forward. Coming up with a universal influenza vaccine, which is a big effort right now on the part of NIH working with industry, is going to be critical if we are going to avoid what could be the greatest threat to human life on the planet in the next 5 or 10 years, which would be a worldwide pandemic of influenza a la 1918. And we're overdue for that. So if we're going to talk about trying to save lives, that's a great place to put our investments. But in terms of the regular process of prevention and treatment of chronic disease, I have to highlight where we're going with precision medicine, and particularly the All of Us program, which is in the process of beta testing what is going to be the largest prospective follow-up study ever conducted in the United States, enrolling 1 million Americans with great diversity in geography and socioeconomic status, ethnicity, age, and gender, and which is going to give us a database accessible to all qualified researchers of unprecedented depth in terms of both environmental exposures, genetic factors, health behaviors, opportunity to get information from wearable sensors and electronic health records. This should be, and it will be, transformative. But it doesn't happen overnight. It gets better and better as such a thing goes forward. Certainly something to watch. The full launch of that is expected late this year or early next year, after we learn everything we can from the beta test, which has already enrolled several thousand people, but in this test mode. And then when it comes to treatment, there's so many things I could say. I'm sure cancer immunotherapy would be one of the things people first wanted to point to, considering what a revolutionary development seems to be happening there, but it doesn't work for everybody, and we need to figure out why. And there are good ideas about how to take the success stories and make them happen more often. And maybe I would just say one final thing in terms of a development in research that I think has only just now begun to be anticipated in terms of what it could mean, and that is the whole process of gene editing with CRISPR-Cas. The opportunity to be able to go in and change a single letter in the genome without leaving other footprints. When you think of those 7,000 genetic diseases for which we know the molecular cause, 7,000, and affecting millions of people, we don't have treatments for any more than about 500 of those. But if we could come up with a strategy, and something that NIH is very interested now in investigating, of CRISPR-Cas, not just ex vivo, but in vivo, to somatic cells, to be able to correct those genetic glitches in a wide variety of those conditions, that would be phenomenal. And it's the sort of thing that could be done not just as a series of one-offs for 7,000 diseases that need 7,000 approaches. This would be something more generalizable. So watch that space. I could go on, but I'll stop here.
Well, Gary, why don't you pick it up from there and talk about cancer and what progress is being made there?
Thank you very much, and I also want to thank Mary and Research America and the organizers for getting this panel together. I was just mentioning backstage how it's really great that all three panels are building on each other as we look at what we're going to do to end disease. From a cancer standpoint, as Dr. Collins said, I mean, we're very excited with what's going on with cancer immunotherapy right now with precision medicine. We're excited from a research perspective. We help fund a lot of basic research as being the largest not-for-profit funder of cancer research in the U.S. So we feel like that we're finally making progress. And today, obviously, we're focused not only on the research aspect of it, but also on the patient support aspect of it, and making sure that that the patients have access to the research and what's coming out of the laboratory now. So, from where I see it today, we're very optimistic. We're very optimistic that in the cancer arena, in the next 15, 20 years, a lot of the common cancers that we see today will be either cured or managed as more like a chronic disease.
Such as which ones?
Breast, prostate, colon, a lot of the more common ones. And maybe I'd like to hear from some of the researchers on the panel. I mean, maybe I'm being a little bit too conservative. Maybe we'll have some of the more aggressive ones as well. But I think one of the things we're challenged with, and this has been mentioned several times today, and I just kind of want to put an exclamation mark on it, is with all the great research that's going on, until we really address the social determinants of health, a lot of people are not going to be able to have access to that research. And if we can, and I agree with Dr. Collins, the primary goal is to stay well and to not get cancer or any other disease, to begin with. So if we can address, some of these socioeconomic issues, educational issues, access issues, that's going to help a lot as the research train starts to pick up speed and move faster. So we're very optimistic from what's going on in the cancer space, but it's multifaceted. So we have to make sure we're addressing the other issues at the same time we're advancing the research.
And Anne, that's very important to you. You want
Yes.
to, yeah.
I'd like to add to that because we know that about 80% of healthcare outcomes are due to non-clinical interventions. And so if we think about that space and we think about where the research needs to focus, we need to think about redirecting or expanding our research dollars into those areas that we know do impact, such as health behaviors, such as the social and economic determinants of health, and the physical environments that our patients are in. So the precision medicine is important because it studies people where they are, and we can tailor and mediate some of the interventions based on genetics, because zip code is as important as genetic code in this country in terms of healing and prevention. So again, I think looking at where our research dollars are being spent, looking at the impact, the true impact of the clinical care paradigm by flipping the paradigm and reinvesting in some of these understandings of social determinants of health are going to be very important to that ultimate success for our patients.
If I can jump all the way down to the end, Dr. Neal. In Washington, there's a lot of debate about delivering care. There's very little debate about curing illnesses. There was a time in the 1990s when there was more discussion along these lines, where even with a Republican Congress, Speaker Gingrich wanted to expand NIH. He wanted to expand funding for science and study. We've moved to a different place now. Why do you think we have moved there, and how, you know, as Ann said, where we put our research dollars matter? What's the role of government in this, in that environment, in today's political environment?
Thank you very much. I mean, you've asked the one, not perhaps nearly one, two non-US people on the panel, so I can only give you a perspective from across the pond from the UK. And clearly there's a debate and balance, isn't there, between spending money on health and research. And I would simply, one of the things we're thinking a lot of at the moment is really unintended variation in healthcare. So if you think of Horizon 1, you know, how could we improve healthcare right now? Whichever country you look in, there is enormous variation in the quality of care given. And I think there's a lot that could be done in terms of providing support to nurses and doctors in the workplace to give guideline-driven care. It's something our colleague from the Heart Foundation was commenting on before. So I think in terms of research, I mean, one of the things I would point out again is, as a practicing physician, an academic physician before I joined Elsevier, there's a huge increase in knowledge. It's growing at 4% a year. And for any expert, it's becoming increasingly difficult to keep up to date. So I think one of the things we could do is to try and provide better tools to inform researchers of things that are going on and getting that practice into care more quickly. I probably can't give you any advice about how the government should respond from a UK perspective, because we're suffering the same attrition in both dollars for clinical care and for research.
I don't think it's up to the federal government to be the only investment in research. And I actually think that if we can expand to the other stakeholders of the outcomes of research, for instance, our corporations and our foundations, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in their Evidence for Action initiative is very much interested in looking at what constitutes a culture of health in this country and what are the dynamics involved in understanding how these multi-sectorial partners are making a difference in our research outcomes and in our health care of our cultures. So I think that we have to step back from relying just on the federal government as the only partner and the only one with moral courage to conduct the nature of the research that is needed in this country.
Although we are a partner and we do have moral courage, thank you.
I said
Dr.
the
Hait,
only
it looked
one.
like you wanted to get into this.
Well, I was thinking about the whole topic of ending disease. Last year, my 15-year-old came home from boarding school, and she said, "Dad, what are you working on?" I said, "A world without disease." And she said, "Well, that's impossible." And I said, "Well, difficult, perhaps, but I never met anyone who said, boy, I'd really like to get a disease." Maybe a show of hands, would anyone in the audience like to get a disease? Almost never. But the facts of the matter are that as you age, and around 50, you begin accumulating diseases. And by the time you're 60, 70, 80, you have 4 or 5 of these things, and they're pretty miserable. And if lifespan is increasing somewhat and you're getting these diseases at 50, you're going to live a longer period of time carrying along these unwanted accompaniments through life. So we're all incubating some disease, whether we like it or not. And our approach has been, soon we'll understand susceptibilities to most diseases. And by putting in real data, we'll understand risk. And what if we could then have more knowledge to understand how we could intervene to either prevent a disease from ever happening or intercept the disease-causing process. And I think if we move in that direction, as Francis was pointing out, prevention, how critically important it is, then I think we'll make real progress. And just one area about research I'll bring up and then shut up is we ask questions like lung cancer, horrible, horrible problem. Ask what causes lung cancer? Everyone in the room would probably say cigarette smoking. If you then say what causes cigarette smoking, there's silence for a long period of time. In the whole area of behavioral research, which always seemed to me a little soft around the edges, which I think an investment in perhaps it's psychobiology, whatever it actually is, to understand why people do certain things, why people make choices, could go a long way to helping us prevent disease.
Dr. Dolsten?
I think it's a great discussion here, and you know, the balance between prevention and intervention is a key part of both public and medical policy. And I think we heard earlier today that unfortunately US has not been the most active country in having enough preventive program, whether it's for preventing the use of painkillers of the opioid nature, or we spoke about the rise of the obesity epidemics. When it comes to infections, we, on contrast, have a proud tradition here to be among the leaders in developing vaccines. And at Pfizer, we have had for almost 2 decades a tremendous experience starting with pneumococcal vaccines, how we're able to immunize infants and now also adults, and actually prevent thousands and thousands of deaths and tens of thousands of hospitalizations every year, and moreover, 1 million days of antibiotic use. So, you know, there is so many more of these bacterial and viral threats, and we see a tremendous opportunity to broaden vaccines as a real pillar in our healthcare system. And it just makes me even more enthusiastic to think about how you can probably rebalance between intervention and prevention. I heard from the colleagues in the cancer space there also about some breakthrough findings in certain type of tumors. I think we heard the new Commissioner Gottlieb speak about the recent approval in certain blood cancers of the gene editing cells. We have seen immuno-oncology initially flourish in certain tumors like melanoma and in kidney cancer, but some of the larger tumors have been less responsive. And I think, like many breakthroughs, it's the tip of the iceberg. We are making some initial progress, and the key is to look upon this as a journey with a tremendous outcome, but it may take longer than we expect. But the rewards will be really rich if we can bring together these efforts for the big challenges like lung cancer, colon cancer, prostate, and breast.
Iris, let's get you in here. Here's a question I have. When we want to end disease, it's, I guess a question that I wonder about is, are we talking first world or third world? I mean, we have lots of medications now that can handle malaria and things like that, and yet we have outbreaks of these diseases that still occur. So how do you have a world without disease when some parts of the world don't have access to all of the things that they need?
Yeah, I fully agree. I think we cannot talk about a world free of disease if we are leaving out certain geographies. I think we have to be very clear in understanding what are the patient needs in these geographies, and they might be very different from first world patient needs. But I think we have an obligation as a world community to really look into what are ways to provide adequate treatment and care to patients in the third world. From a UCB perspective, we're trying to address this by working with physicians in the field of epilepsy in Africa, in rural areas in China and other geographies, because we have a long-standing leadership in the care for epilepsy patients, and we feel a very strong obligation and commitment to ensure that we bring our medicines also to patients in the developing world. We painfully recognize that this is only a drip in the ocean and that it's difficult, even in collaboration with the World Health Organization, to really provide a complete and comprehensive care approach. So there's definitely opportunity for us, but I feel very strongly that as a World Healthcare community, we have an obligation there.
Doctor?
No, I think it's also the responsibility of great corporations to take on the issues of global public health. I mean, you go back to what Merck did with ivermectin and river blindness, what J&J recently did with an Ebola vaccine, with drug-resistant tuberculosis, making a chewable version of mebendazole to deworm kids around the world. These are responsibilities for corporations, very profitable corporations, to do the right thing in the world. And I think it's our responsibility to step up and bear our part of the effort.
Glad we're talking about the fact that when we say a world free of disease, we're talking about the whole world, because if this is just a target for the developed countries, then we have basically failed to live up to our responsibilities. And I think what Bill is saying is very true. There's a tradition here of that kind of outreach that we need to expand. We also need to work harder to help the low and middle income countries develop their own capacity for doing research and developing, therefore, research projects that are targeted at the needs that they see, as opposed to something that somebody outside of their area has decided is the need. We have, I'm afraid, need to switch the kind of concept for research in a place like Africa from what might be called donorship to ownership, where basically African governments, African institutions develop their own capabilities and strength. Working with the Gates Foundation and with the Wellcome Trust and with AISA, which is the Alliance for Accelerating Excellence Science in Africa, located in Nairobi, and now in a partnership in a discussion phase with multiple companies and philanthropies. There's a momentum behind an idea of building something called Cary, the Coalition for African Research and Innovation, to try to see what could be done over maybe a 10-year period to get us into a position where African research institutions have increasing strength and infrastructure, and that in turn keeps the brain drain from continuing to deprive Africa of its best and brightest. This is something we all ought to get on board with. Africa does have, in many places now, some more economic growth opportunities. African governments are beginning to see they could make these investments, and they are in fact good investments just in terms of economics. But unless we all kind of rally around this and figure out how to make it happen, it's going to take a very long time. So I just want to put that out there as a current initiative that needs everybody's support.
Dr. Neal, did you want to get in?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's a very interesting point, and you start looking at the causes of early death in some African countries. You know, the Gambia, for instance, maternal mortality is a huge problem, and it's really a delivery of basic care to people. So it's a thing of actually getting things we know right now how to deliver really high quality care into different environments. And I think your point about local ownership is absolutely key. I mean, I've been interacting with the Gambia, and it's actually critical that they're taking that forward. It's a completely valid point. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add, I mean, I think that I think as the research advances, that we have a great opportunity to apply what we already know, not only here in the United States, but around the world. You know, and to Dr. Collins' point of certainly helping other countries get sustainable, you know, research programs or initiatives or sustainable prevention programs. But going back to Bill's comment about lung cancer and about cigarette smoking, you know, we know for a fact that tobacco causes 80% of all lung cancers and 30% of all cancers. So, and we also know today, I would say there's probably not a lot of people in this room that use tobacco. So we're kind of like talking to ourselves, but we know the groups that are using tobaccos, and we can use our knowledge and our technology and our behavioral learnings to help, hopefully, one, help them stop. But something that came up in the previous panels that was really important is, you know, where are we putting the effort today around education? So it's, you know, as Dr. Collins says, it's a lot better to not have a disease versus trying to cure a disease. Well, it's a lot better to make sure that we're educating people early on what, how to lead a healthy lifestyle. So what are we doing in the schools? What are we doing in communities? What are we doing here in the United States? And then how can we transport that or share that outside the U.S.? Because until we look at, all of us look at healthcare as an investment versus a cost, all parties, and we all get serious about it and apply what we know and make sure that the young generations are embracing that. Even with all the research that's going on, we're not going to get to where we need to be. And that's true for cancer, heart disease, diabetes, anything that's out there. So I think there's a huge opportunity as this research train accelerates that we start applying a lot of the things that we already know work to make sure that we're trying to move somewhat in sequence with it.
I was just thinking of two themes, trying to make an impact also in the less privileged part of the world, and educating and training like Africa, and also heard about maternal health from the other side. So one experience we are getting at this moment that I think is very exciting, working together with the Gates Foundation, we are developing simultaneously a vaccine for maternal immunization to protect the newborn infant from group P streptococci, which is a vulnerable part early in life that can cause both fatality and a lot of sequelae for life. And through Gates Foundation's, of course, experience in Africa, we are in parallel doing studies in the developed world and in the developing world. And you could just think about one of the few products that actually would be available almost at the same time in these two very continents that are so different, because many of our earliest experiences have been on treatments that have been available decades here. We're trying to make them available in Africa, but for me it would be a dream to come through if they almost instantly will become available in both continents.
So, Dr. Cary, let's say you all achieve your goal. What does that world look like? And in every story of utopia, of some sort of utopia, the story or the movie, the spine of it is the unintended consequence. So what is, he was mentioning that you live longer you could live longer while you're harboring a disease.
You don't want to do that.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good time. But really, what is a world without disease?
Well, if we could get rid of the sagging, I'd be really happy. But other than that.
Researchers, please take note.
One of the things I've been thinking about, or related to that question, has to do with productivity. So imagine the economic impact if people were healthier longer in terms of economic productivity, and how that might translate then into the opportunity to have even more investment in further research once you get that economics reinvested in whatever the country decides. So one would be an economic engine from increased productivity. We already talked about the sagging, and then I think the third thing might have to do with the fact that in many of our disciplines, we are seeing retirements in terms of numbers, when in fact we need to see those in terms of lost intellectual capacity in this country, and especially for innovation. And so I'm thinking that if we were a world without disease, we would have much more innovation, people would be innovating longer, and there would be much more payoffs for that. The downside to that, in my opinion, is what about the overpopulation? How do we gather the resources then on the non-health side to be able to support people living longer? And that would be a much more expensive proposition.
We developed a term for a world without disease. We called it, as opposed to immortality, immorbidity. So that's living a life free of disease and enjoying it. the question that came up was, well, then what do you die from?
Exactly.
And we said, well, we'll worry about that when we get there.
One of the interesting things that was the unintended consequences, and partly what we regard as disease. And some of the most passionate people I've come across are people who've been designated as having a disability, and whether that should or could have been edited out. And you then really exposing really quite significant ethical problems and the unintended consequences of evolution, if you like. So my grandson, for instance, has got quite bad Asperger's syndrome, and this is one end of a spectrum where if you said, well, we should get rid of that, what effect would that have for future generations? So I think we've got to be quite humble in the face of natural selection and evolution as to what we interfere with. I think it's it's an incredibly complex business once you start designating those sorts of things as disease.
So I was thinking on, what does it mean, ending disease? And clearly, ending some disease in the near future is very compelling, and ending fear of disease. And Francis spoke a little bit about the tremendous technologies for rewriting the code of life, DNA, that are now appearing. So I do think that some of the disease that are hereditary and dependent on a miswritten gene will be soon examples of disease that will be ended. In other cases, it's a longer journey, but if we can end the fear of disease, and the fear is often that you don't feel trust that there will be new treatment options that are tolerable and that give you a life quality. And I think that's a mission that we have been very active on. As we get into success with a treatment option, we start to think about how long will it last and what can we then offer that continues to make patients live with disease but without fear of disease. And that's at least to have won a significant battle, and meanwhile it gives us time to end that disease.
At the risk of taking us down from the utopia, I think we should not underestimate, and just to build on your comments, we should not underestimate what it really means, right? Because in the end, it would mean that we completely and fully, in all of its dimensions, understand human biology, and that we understand in every nuance the aberrations of biology that make the reason for disease. And that's a huge undertaking, and we're far away from it. I'm with Dr. Collins that, in monogenetic diseases like Huntington's, we will probably see CRISPR becoming an available therapy at some point in time. We will see probably induced pluripotent stem cells together with CRISPR having a value in neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease. But if I'm just looking at the topic of Parkinson's disease, it means that we much better understand than we do now what causes the degeneration of the dopamine-producing neurons. We have to diagnose much earlier, and we have to find the pathogenetic mechanisms in all these patients, and they are not the same. We know some, but they are not the same. And then we have to agree on how do we bring these medicines forward that will be disease modifying, but maybe not symptom controlling. So I'm just talking about a relatively small patient population that we need to dissect in subpopulations to make sure that we maximize the treatment effect.
Well, that was one other question I had, and Dr. Collins, I'll throw this one to you first. And that, I'm a layperson, right? So I read it, I see it, and it seems like these things become priorities in waves. People have been on the hunt to cure cancer for decades, and from everything you're saying, we're starting to really make some serious progress there. It seems like now the emphasis is turning to diseases of the brain, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. I could be wrong. Anybody can correct me, and I will say you're right. I was wrong. But I'm wondering, so if we're moving now to really emphasize and start to make some progress with the diseases of the brain, what's next? What are the next big targets?
So it may seem as if there's sort of a fashion of the day that medical research is kind of moving all of the resources over here and then, let's move them over there. that actually isn't the way it is carried out, and certainly there is a complicated calculus that goes into a decision about where medical research resources ought to be spent, certainly at NIH and in industry and other countries as well. And it's a mix of what's the public health need, which is certainly huge when it comes to something like Alzheimer's disease, but it's also a part of it is scientific opportunity. Do you at the moment actually see a path forward that supplied with resources could make more rapid progress? That's the thing we're always trying to balance, is to figure out where are the places that are ripe for a push that would have the maximum impact on people's lives. And I think much of this is driven in the conversation we're having about maybe we're not focusing so much on lifespan as we're focusing on health span, the span of your period of life where you are essentially, when somebody asks you, are you doing okay? You're able to say, yeah, I'm feeling pretty good, I'm healthy, which right now all too often cannot be said by people throughout the course of life, but especially in the older age categories. And we would like to figure out how to give that health span a greater measure, even as we admit, and let's admit, even though we're having a wonderful utopia here, the death rate, folks, is going to be 1 per person. I'm sorry. Unless you're going to come up with something really amazing, I think utopia will still be guided by that. But you'd want to have that health span prolonged as long as possible before that 1 per person kind of kicks in. In terms of what you ask about brain diseases, it is true that we see an opportunity now scientifically, and it's pretty bold and audacious to say this, that we might actually be able to understand the human brain, which is the most complicated biological structure in the known universe, maybe the most complicated structure of any sort. You have 86 billion neurons between your ears, and each one of them has maybe 1,000 connections. And it does amazing things with very little power requirements that we really don't understand. And we are on the brink here with a lot of new technologies of beginning to unravel those mysteries and figuring out how circuits in the brain, not just individual neurons, do what they do in real time. If we had that foundational information about normal function, then we'd be a lot further along understanding epilepsy and Alzheimer's and schizophrenia and traumatic brain injury and Parkinson's and all the other things that we desperately need a better handle on. And I think the community is revved up about this, and a lot of the young talent in biological science is migrating into neuroscience because they have that same sense. Hey, we could be part of something really dramatic here in terms of understanding. And of course, if you want to ask, okay, economically and in terms of human tragedy, where are the places that we still don't do very well? Well, start with Alzheimer's disease, where already more than 5 million people affected, expected to rise substantially as our population ages. Economic costs already over $200 billion a year, going towards $1 trillion. We have to come up with something here, or it is going to break our bank and break our hearts. And so the public health urgency there is incredibly compelling. So there is a reason why you might have sort of seen that shift, but it's not as if we're walking away from cancer, because just at the moment cancer is getting excited, nor are we walking away from diabetes, because maybe we'll figure out with stem cells how to come up with an alternative to kidney transplants, which is costing our nation a huge amount of money for all those people on dialysis. Maybe that's also in the works. Kind of put all these things together, and it's an amazingly broad menu. But oftentimes, sort of public discourse tends to want to focus on 1 or 2 of those things, rightly so, because of a pressing need or a scientific opportunity. That's why it sort of seems like maybe we're being inconsistent in our view of the future.
Well, actually, I think you answered my question, and it was an
Shoot, that's
interesting
good.
answer. That indeed, if there's quiet work that is maintained all the time behind the scenes, but when you see that there's almost a eureka moment close, then resources go in that direction.
And one more thing, a lot of what's going on behind the scenes is basic science. It's not the sort of thing that people write articles about because we don't oftentimes even know where it's going, but it is the foundation of everything. The biggest mistake we could make right now is to move all of our scientific effort in very disease-focused ways and forget the basic science foundation, because then we'd have no future.
Yeah, I'd like to, just to add to that, I mean, we are making, or great progress is being made in cancer today, but we still have a long way to go, so, but I think what's happening in cancer maybe today is, what my colleague from Pfizer said earlier is that, when I was growing up, people lived in the fear of having cancer because it was basically a death sentence. If you got it, you were going to die. It's just a matter of when. I think today with the advances that's going on in cancer, you know, people are starting to say, maybe if I have a cancer diagnosis, it's not a death sentence. You know, maybe I can live a somewhat normal life. And now even today with the immunotherapy, maybe I won't have to be subjected, you know, to chemotherapy and go through all the side effects and all that. So I think that, and that's part of the story too, is helping the public understand what's going on. Because one of the challenges we still have today in the cancer arena is people who are living in fear of it are afraid to go to their doctors because they're afraid they might have it. And they need to do just the opposite, because the sooner we can catch it, the greater the likelihood we can do something about it. And this whole conversation about utopia reminds me of first time, I guess 20 years ago when I met Dr. LaSalle the fall. He told me, he said, Gary said, I want to tell you what the secret to life is. And I said, awesome, let me have it, I'm all ears. He said, the secret to life is to die young at the oldest possible age. So I think it's what we're talking about now, 20 years later.
Yes.
Just to
So
follow
I
that, Archie Cochrane, who was the critical person in designing phase 3 randomized trials, decided when he was 65 to start smoking and riding a motorcycle on the grounds that, you know, it's the same thing.
I think this idea that it's a very critical point that Gary was making, and it raises some systemic issues, and that's getting to a disease at the earliest possible point, including when it's not a disease. So for example, this morning, or at least not defined as a disease, this morning it was mentioned before we got into the opioid epidemic, prediabetes. And prediabetes is a definition of an A1C that's not quite diabetic, or fasting glucose, not quite in the range. But on the other hand, these people, as you follow them over time, go on to develop all the complications of diabetes. And if you take that to its logical conclusion, once you get the complications of diabetes, you have a horrible life to live, from kidney failure to eye problems to heart attacks, to all the things we heard about. But yet when you start talking about intervening in pre-diabetics, there are a million roadblocks that people raise throughout the whole system, including the regulators, the people even in my own company who I say, we have to stop worrying about decreasing glucose. We have to get to pre-diabetes and figure out what's going on. And there are people in this room who know very well that that goes over like a lead balloon, because someone says, well, the trials will take 100 years. There's no regulatory endpoint. Well, I'm not even sure there's a market for these drugs. And I say, well, that doesn't sound right to me. If we could take someone who is on their way to getting a disease as bad as diabetes and intercept that process, I would think that there'd be a very good market if that's the end result.
I was thinking, as Bill brought up, getting in early into diseases, and some diseases like the metabolic diabetes, you can measure markers, and you can see, of course, gain in body weight and risk factors. Often in brain diseases, the challenge has been they develop over many, many decades, whether psychiatric, schizophrenia, or neurological. And we have great difficulty to find a way to stay close to millions and millions of patients in order to be able to intervene early. There is an interesting technological revolution in the Internet of all things, and the use of all kind of device that measure your steps or your internet behavior that will increasingly allow us to see change in behavior. So for example, multitasking that most of us do changes when you have more of neurological impact on your behavior. And you can actually influence and train it that allow you to perform like 10, 20 years younger in life. Similar, we know that motor functions like very early Parkinson is very difficult to detect, but now with everyone wearing these bands that measure your steps, you can soon look at how you take your steps. You can monitor your language, what sites you visit on internet. So I think we'll see in the future that everyone will be able to see if there are changes, and if there is also hope for interventions. This will allow us to look at brain diseases as completely different, maybe like you described, pre-diabetes.
And there's also reason to
can
suspect that these diseases are easier to treat. I'm not sure about this, but there are some examples the earlier you get to them. So for example, aspirin is a pretty good treatment for colonic polyps, the precursor of colon cancer. But if you treat colon cancer with an aspirin, the probably only thing that'll happen is you'll bleed. So, and it's same perhaps with other diseases that become more and more complex. Certainly malignancies become more and more complex over time. So the earlier you can push back the diagnosis, and this points to the critical importance of more sensitive, more powerful diagnostics, I think the better the outcomes will be.
My key concern around this, and just to build on what has been said, is in the light of the dimensions of the issues to address and the opportunities likewise, do we have enough cooperation all across to really tackle these issues? Because, for example, whether we look at, and I stay with my Parkinson's disease example, whether we look at neurodegenerative diseases and the efforts that are required to find biomarkers, to diagnose them early, to follow patients properly, do we maximize the opportunity that we have in a pre-competitive space to work together to understand these prodromal stages?
So I'd love to address that exact point, because on the stage here are some of us that have been trying to figure out how can we identify models that allow the pre-competitive space to be richly populated with ideas and resources. The Accelerating Medicines Partnership, which involves 10 pharmaceutical companies, including 2 represented here, and it has as co-chairs of his executive committee, Michael Dolsten and myself, has in fact initiated efforts for Alzheimer's disease, for diabetes, for rheumatoid arthritis, and lupus, and very recently for Parkinson's disease, and with a serious discussion now about doing something similar for cancer immunotherapy and for opioids, has emerged, I think, as a very compelling model of how to put public and private sectors around the same table, figure out what fits into that pre-competitive space, then design an actual work plan with very specific goals, milestones, deliverables, budgets, and then everybody's got skin in the game, because it's not just a intellectual experience, it's also one that requires resources, and then we hold ourselves accountable. That kind of model, I think we could do even more of for efforts of this sort. It's a little exhausting, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of commitment at the right level. But I'm glad you brought it up, because it's one thing to say we got scientific opportunity, it's another to say, are we taking advantage of that scientific opportunity by getting all hands on deck from all sectors, including advocates, including philanthropy, to make sure that we're pushing this forward, that we've got our foot really down on the accelerator.
When you talk about commitment, I just want to call out, when we first started doing this, I was so impressed. Francis was on all the calls. Now that's commitment. That was impressive.
Still am.
As a daily journalist, a pre-competitive environment is like.
Sorry for you.
I'm going to open it up here. If you guys have questions, do you all have mics that you're walking? Okay.
Yeah, so I'm kind of curious. I mean, we've heard this alluded to throughout the conversation. So we've talked a lot about prevention, right? So stopping something before it even starts. And you know, today we do a lot of disease care. We don't do very much health care, really. And this idea that Bill mentioned earlier, intervening at the earliest point. And that brings up this issue of biomarkers, making a diagnosis on the basis of biomarkers rather than what the patient experiences or the doctor recognizes as symptoms. What's the role for the NIH, for example, in pushing that from research into practice, or to get that data from great research programs into the hands of regulators so that they can evaluate the use of those tools for trials or ultimately for making these diagnoses at a point much earlier in the disease? And how can that process be streamlined? Because I think it's a real challenge. I've read thousands of papers about biomarkers, very few of which are in use today.
That's a great question, and it's part of this whole ecosystem that needs to work together. Certainly NIH and our partners in industry are very invested in this whole effort of trying to identify reliable biomarkers. I'll take Alzheimer's disease. Will it turn out that we actually figure out how you can prevent the symptoms of that disease if you use amyloid or tau PET scans to identify the people who are at high risk but have not yet developed symptoms, and then you apply the appropriate therapies to slow or stop the process. That would be a great biomarker story. It's a hard one to come up with the evidence that will convince people who are skeptical, and we should all be skeptical until the evidence is there. So that means industry and NIH working together with FDA to figure out how do you qualify such a biomarker. And ultimately, it means you got to convince CMS and all of the reimbursement systems that this is ready to be compensated for in the practice of medicine. And you can't lose that one as well. One of the things I've tried really hard to do as NIH director is to be sure that the lines of communication between NIH, FDA, and CMS are wide open, and I think they are. But oftentimes, it's tough to get the science to the point where you're absolutely able to make the case. That's the big push. I think we're all committed to getting there.
We have one up here and one back there.
Right here, I have the next mic. Lucinda Main, Colleges of Pharmacy, and as a 13-year stage 0 breast cancer survivor, I am all about early screening and effective treatment. But that has nothing to do with my question. For the higher education people here and watching, what are your thoughts about preparing the next generation of scientists? What are the critical areas, competencies, et cetera, that we should be thinking about driving into our graduate programs?
So I'll start. Well, first of all, I do believe that if we flip the lens through which we view health and disease, that we need to train them to do adequate assessments in terms of social determinants of health and where patients live. And then secondly, we need to look at health behaviors. Health behaviors are critical. I mean, we just heard where we've got an HPV winner for the Lasker Award, and yet we know that we're not meeting the Healthy People 2020 goals for HPV uptake, okay? Because people are afraid of the vaccine, and they're in very specific communities. So something's going on there. So I think those two things for sure. And then the third area I would recommend is looking at the population health as a perspective on the disease, as opposed to and in addition to the individual. So in some countries, they really start with the big picture. They start with public health and population health in their workforce development. And then through that, they begin to narrow and define the focus in terms of disease. So they start with health and the infrastructure and what works on the research, and then they began to look very specifically. So we might look to other countries and what they're doing well. And then finally, I have to say it needs to be interprofessional in terms of workforce development, because no science is an N of one anymore.
I would echo that. I would say curiosity, the willingness to collaborate, and the humility to accept that in today's world, nobody knows and understands everything and at all. And I hope that we will also be in a position to provide decision support to our young physicians, that all of the data that are available will be used to help the young physician to say, you know, this patient that I have in front of me, how does he cluster with other patients where we know what the best therapy is? Again, if I talk about epilepsy, patients often have a year-long journey to get to the right medicine that provides seizure freedom to them, because they're very much dependent on the individual knowledge of their physician and the physician preferences. If we would have a tool that would, based on everything that's available in terms of real-world data, say a patient with this characteristics is predicted to respond best to this combination of therapies, year-long journeys to get to a good treatment could be replaced by one push of the button. And
Dr.
I hope
Dolsten
that we'll
wants
have
to weigh
that.
in, too.
Yeah, so, you know, I want to make a plea for the funding of science in the United States and the funding of NIH. We used to rise up and be proud of as a nation to be leading in the willingness to put in science for the long term, and to be looking at physicians and the medical practice as an occupation that were doing the good because you were made from early on in life felt a call to action. My son is in college, 19 years old. He is really talented in science. He loves science. He spent summers at some of the best labs in cancer research. And do you know what the postdocs tell him? This is not the place if you're as talented as you are, they tell him.
Wow.
The funding is dwindling. We are lucky if we can get another postdoc, and we may need 5 postdocs because there are no permanent positions. And it's so sad to have him come home and say, you know, should I take on the challenges? All of my friends are saying we hear such a bad sentiment about the willingness to fund science. So I think unless we turn that around, we'll see a lot of the most passionate talents not go into science. And it starts all with having sufficient NIH funding, which is the source for all the labs across the nation, as well as Bethesda. And the willingness for all of us to say that, you know, we are here to make sure we can live a rich life. It's not just about better cars or a lot of other distractions in life.
I wonder also what's going on in the medical schools. I know where Francis and I train, sort of the highest calling, the role models in the faculty were those people who were trying to understand the disease the patients we were seeing. We admired the master clinicians, but even the pinnacle were those who were digging in and understanding the causation of disease, and I think that's what motivated so many of us to go into research. We might not have thought about it before.
So we only have 2 minutes left, so let's try to get 2 quick questions in. So, right there, he's been waiting.
I'm John Dwyer from the Global Alzheimer's Platform. I'm one of those pre-competitive things you didn't know about.
Nor understand.
I'll let you know when I do. So in our work, what's become clear as we watch the development process for drugs is the lack. We want to get more runway, especially in Alzheimer's, for a therapy to get developed. And the community, and Dr. Collins, you spoke to it a little bit. What can we do more effectively to marry science and nutrition and fitness in a way where you are actually saying that these are steps to both deterring disease, it's actually got very profound effects on changing your risk factors and creating curiosity about further exploration of medical research, because it is in Kansas City, where you're from, there's wonderful research funded by NIH on fitness and nutrition in deferring Alzheimer's disease. They even have a kitchen in the Darn Research Center. But this is unusual in the extreme. And so you get a lot of equivocation out of the scientists about what works, what doesn't work, across all. And so what can we do to give laymen the ability to say, there is something I can do right now, and that may lead us into a positive slippery slope of interest in research more profoundly?
Well, certainly you make a great point that the number of opportunities are wide in terms of interventions for a condition like Alzheimer's. It is encouraging that the Congress sees this now as such an important, compelling research need. Just today, the Senate committee that oversees appropriations has increased the funding for Alzheimer's disease for the 4th or 5th year in a row. So Alzheimer's funding at NIH is now almost 3 times what it was a half a decade ago, growing as faster than anything that people can remember. That makes it possible then to conduct more research where you consider more kinds of interventions as opposed to having to limit it to a smaller set. As you know, those kinds of studies are incredibly complicated and expensive, but I think we have opportunities now to do that. And believe me, NIH would agree with you completely. If we could identify interventions that people who are concerned about Alzheimer's could undertake that they knew were going to reduce their risk, that would be a huge contribution. Right now, the data is still a little hard to get your fingers on and say exactly what works. And a lot of the time, you can't be sure that it does. We need more data.
Well, that's the end of our time. Our panelists, I'm sure, would be happy to take your questions if you catch them after. I want to thank all of you all for staying for the final panel. And I want to thank all of the panelists for their excellent observations.